Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Subcontractor Survival Guide, Managing CMMC Risk Across the Contract Lifecycle, presented by Neosystems. I'm Don Carnevale, Director of Marketing at Neosystems, and I'll be the moderator for today's event. This is the first webinar in our five-part series entitled From Surviving to Thriving, the CMMC Enforcement Era Playbook. Please keep an eye out for invitations to future episodes coming soon. If you have any questions during the presentation, you can enter them into the Q&A area within Zoom. We will have some time at the end of the presentation to answer your questions. Also, we will make the webinar recording and presentation slides available to all registrants in the coming days. Now I'd like to introduce the host for today's discussion, Megan Kennett from Neosystems. Megan?
Thank you, Don, and thanks to everyone for joining us today. Truly grateful to have you here. I'm Megan Kennett, Product Marketing Manager at Neosystems, and I'm honored to welcome you to the Subcontractor Survival Guide, Managing CMMC Risk Across the Contract Lifecycle, where we're going to discuss pre-award decisions, how to handle flow down, and what happens when things change mid-contract. And if you're new to Neosystems, we've been in the space of serving government contractors and not nonprofits for over 23 years. This is the world we live in: compliance, contracts, cybersecurity, IT, the messy reality of keeping operations moving forward while meeting federal requirements. We want this session to be interactive, as Don said, useful and actionable. So please drop your questions in the Q&A, and we'll try to get to many as we can today. And any we can't, we'll follow up on after the session. I'm privileged to be joined by three of the brightest minds on the topic today. First, thrilled to welcome Eric Crusius. Eric is a leading government contracts attorney who advises contractors across the full contract lifecycle, from bid strategy to flow down decisions to enforcement risk and False Claims Act exposure. What sets Eric apart is his ability to explain not just what the rules say, but how the government applies them when it matters. If you want to understand CMMC flowdown and risk through a legal lens, Eric is the voice you want in the room. Welcome, Eric.
Appreciate the introduction, Megan.
Absolutely. Next up is David Carlino, Neosystems Chief Information Security Officer. David brings more than 20 years of experience securing everything from scrappy startups to complex enterprise environments. He leads our product development efforts with one hand, and with the other, he makes sure our biggest ideas don't violate the laws of physics, logic, or NIST 800-171. David brings a risk-based lens to CMMC, helping organizations understand not just what's required, but what actually creates enterprise risk when scope drifts or assumptions go unchecked. Welcome, David.
Thanks, Megan.
And last but not least, we have Ed Bassett, Neosystems cybersecurity evangelist. Ed is the guy you bring in when you want more than a regulation recited back to you. He'll tell you what it means, where it came from, what's going to break first if you ignore it. He's helped countless contractors turn, we should probably do something about that one day, into real measurable security maturity. If David gives you the strategy, Ed gives you the straight talk, with just enough tough love to keep your POAM short and your audit trail clean. With legal risks and cybersecurity all represented here, let's take a quick look at what we'll cover today and we'll dive right in. Next slide, please. All right, so we're going to cover the latest DoD FAQs, scope, perception versus reality, what primes can ask, what they're expected to ask, how flowdown works across tiers, and what you can do to help your MSPs reduce your risk. And then we'll open it up for live Q&A. Our goal again is that you walk away with practical guidance that you can act on tomorrow, whether that's tightening your assessment scope, validating what's in SPRS, or asking better questions of your supply chain. But before we get started, and so we can get to know all of you a little better, we're going to conduct a live poll. All right. Where do you fall in the supply chain? Looks like we've got some good answers. We've got a good crowd.
You guys
Don,
were
I'll
fast
let
in
you
your
end that
replies.
one.
That was
Would
incredible.
you?
Everybody was so quick in their replies.
I
I feel like we
know.
used to ask this question years ago and everyone's sort of, I don't know.
15% don't know, so we'll let them chime in later. Awesome. Thank you all. That's perfect. All right. Thank you, Don. All right. So with that, let's start with the DoD as clarified most recently and why it matters. So sticking with the theme of eliminating gray areas for some of those that were with us in our earlier session, and these FAQs are relevant to the topics today. So the DoD gave us a little more clarity this month when they released these additional FAQs that align directly with some additional guidance. So we're going to weave those in plain English. These are clearly some of the areas contractors are struggling with. So question 10, hard copy CUI. If your organization strictly handles hard copy CUI, you're not assessed under CMMC. But, and this is a big but, the moment that data touches a system, whether it's scanned, emailed, uploaded, printed from a computer, CMMC applies. So paper is fine. The second it goes digital, the rules change. Question 11. Can encryption alone create logical separation for a network within a CMMC assessment scope? The answer is no. Encryption alone does not provide logical separation. In other words, just because something's encrypted, it doesn't mean it's out of scope. Encryption does protect confidentiality, but it does not replace segmentation, access controls, or boundary enforcement. So question 12, this one clears up a lot of confusion. Must enterprise networking components be included in scope when encrypted CUI leaves an enclave? So enclaves can absolutely prevent scope creep, but boundaries have to be done right, documented, enforced, and defendable. So CMMC does not punish good architecture, but it does punish fuzzy boundaries. And while the DoD FAQs help clarify these gray areas, they're still expecting contractors to be much more intentional about scope, boundaries, and reality versus assumptions. And that tees us up perfectly into the next topic. Why owning your scope is one of the most important steps in succeeding with CMMC. So other than those clarifying points, nothing new or unusual to report in the ecosystem, which in many ways is the point, right? The DoD isn't introducing surprises, they're tightening expectations, removing excuses, which brings us into our scope and more specifically, subcontractor risk and flow down. David, I want to start with you. When we say own your CMMC scope, what are we talking about here? And where do you most often see subcontractors getting the scope wrong?
Two great questions. I think the conversation on owning your scope has to do with you, the subcontractor or prime, the one handling the CUI data. You need to understand why you're doing that, what you intend to do, and what you have to do all around your data flow for CUI. Do you have to store it on a computer? Do you have to print it out? No one else can really give you those answers. If you're not sure, you can design a system that has flexibility that would allow you to print when you need to. If you are sure and you do own your scope, you can kind of pare down on the number of if, maybe, when I need a feature, and get down to brass tacks with exactly what feature sets you need. So the ownership and the risk management belongs to the entity processing the controlled unclassified information. And the risk, if you get it wrong, is there's multiple impacts there. There's first and foremost the impact that if you design it wrong for the wrong people, when you sit down to try to use it, the shoe doesn't fit, and your ability to deliver on your mission or your contract that you signed is questionable. And you start running into, okay, I do need to make a change. I do need to print from my enclave. And some of these slight changes in data flow at this point can drive a reassessment. The significant change concept to your architecture drives a reassessment. So misscoping can cost you a lot of design time lost, designing for the wrong people. And then it also can be painful to migrate. And at the end of the day, you might have to reassess if you're authorizing new tools or technologies that are significantly different than you first assessed. And that doesn't really get into the, growth and kind of the concept of growth. So I think, Ed, if you can give some examples about why flexibility is important, um, you need to own your scope for today, but you also do need to be planning for the future, and that can be quite the balancing act.
Yeah, I think, there's two choices allowed in the scoping, right? You can either have your whole enterprise be in scope, or you could choose an enclaving where you choose a subset. So, for most people, the enclave makes a lot of sense because it's a smaller, simpler scope, right? So other than a sort of small, homogeneous organization where the enterprise isn't that big or complicated to begin with, we're seeing that most people are choosing an enclaving approach, and they want to keep that scope small and compact because it's cheaper, quicker, easier to get it certified. But then, as you pointed out, David, you may find yourself without the capabilities you need to deliver on a contract, right? So in the worst case scenario, you've gotten an enclave approved, and then you realize you need some other computing capabilities that are part of your enterprise IT or some other system to do the work, but that's not been certified, so you can't use it. So you can find yourself sort of painted into a corner there where the thing that you got certified, although it was cheap and fast and easy, doesn't have the capabilities you need. So that thinking ahead, thinking forward about what kind of contracts you're looking at, what kind of CUI handling you're going to have to do, who the users are, making sure there's some room for growth there. And I guess I'll throw on there to say, don't make it necessarily start with it bigger than it needs to be, but make sure that the design you've chosen has the ability to grow without it being a significant change, right? So there's some good guidance in the rule about what a significant change is and isn't. Things that are significant change require reassessment. It's a new CMMC scope, and you need to get a whole new assessment done, whether that's self-assessment or third party. And if you're making sort of operational changes, right, taking an existing scope that's been certified and making changes to it, you can manage those internally through your change management process. So some of that's how you define which are which. How do you define your scope, right? Do you define your scope as 10 PCs and then adding 11 is a significant change? Let's not, right? Let's say we're going to define our scope as a whole bunch of PCs. We don't know how many. It's going to change over time. We're going to manage that with change control and inventory, not as a scope change. So that's a little bit about how you design it, how you document it, how you apply those the guidance that's in the scoping guide in a way that's most favorable to your growth plans.
Thank you, Ed. Yep. So grounding that down in practical action terms, the systems, the users, the tools, the data paths, you really need to clearly define all of that touches CUI, because the scope is the foundation of your CMMC success. And if it's not defined and clear, it doesn't just create technical problems, it creates assessment issues, contract friction, and potentially legal risk downstream. So when scope isn't clear, perception and reality part ways. Let's talk about why that matters. All right, so let's pause just for a moment, because this is where a lot of organizations get uncomfortable, because what they think they have reported may not match what exists. And your trail map needs to match the mountain. So over to you, Eric. From a legal and enforcement perspective, why does misalignment between SBRS scores, SSPs, and reality matter so much right now? And what are you seeing happen when primes or subcontractors don't clearly define their scope, especially the people and systems that manage CUI?
Sure. I'll take that second question first because it's off of some terrific points that David and Ed made. But as far as defining scope, it all goes back to start with to the contract. As David alluded to in his comments, contracting officers are going to ask for a unique identification number before a company is awarded a contract. And that unique identification number is where they're going to expect all the data relevant to that contract to be stored. And if the scope is not defined well and there's data sitting outside that scope, then that's going to cause, if nothing else, a contract issue, especially if there are cybersecurity incidents associated with that information. So it's really important from a contract standpoint to get the scope right and have consistency with that scope across the board where that data is residing in order to make sure that there's no adverse contract action. John Teneglia from Defense Cost and Pricing a couple of years ago released a memo that talked to the fact that contracting officers should pay attention to whether their contractors are complying with the cybersecurity requirements, and if they're not, to do everything up and to take contract action against them. So this is something that the department is looking at closely and will continue to monitor. And of course, you can go down, I don't have to lead you down that path of parade of horribles to suspension, debarment, into False Claims Act, but those are all things that can come from a misaligned scope as well in an extreme circumstance. But if nothing else, alignment is important because of the contract actions that can be taken. And then when you talk about kind of aligning your score, your SSP, and your SPURS score, a lot of those same considerations apply. We don't have to go back very far to look at DOJ press releases to see that they're looking very closely at SPURS scores in the supplier performance risk system to make sure that they're accurate. And to the extent that a contractor knows that they're not accurate or is not proactively seeing if they're accurate, obviously there are False Claims Act implications with that as well. And having an accurate score in both directions is really important. If your score is too low and you're actually doing better than your score indicates, you may not get contract awards because the government doesn't want to do business with somebody with too low a score. And on the other hand, if it's showing something that it's not, it's showing a perfect score, and in reality it's 32 or something like that, that raises risks on the other side. And then kind of when you're thinking about that supply chain, subcontractors in the supply chain, that's even more tricky because contractors relying on subcontractors are relying on them to have accurate scores and accurate environments to what they're telling to the government. There's a lot of ways to solve that, and I think we're going to talk about that a little bit more later. But as a whole, the supply chain issue is one that's going to be sticky for a long time. Megan, back to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Eric. That's perfect. All right. So I guess I didn't know if Ed, if you were trying to chime in there or not, but
yeah, I was trying to chime in, and I wanted to point out an audience question that came in too. I know we're doing those at the end, but this one's really relevant. Is what is an enclave, right? So we've talked about a little bit about enterprise versus enclave. There's two paths allowed in CMMC. So an enclave is just a subset of your total IT footprint that is logically or physically segregated, and that's where you would store your CUI, FCI, other government information. So for companies that choose to get their entire enterprise, all their IT certified, that's one path. And for companies that want to sort of shrink that footprint and save some money by only complying where they need to, they choose the enclave path. So it's sort of a generic term. And I think as we listen to what Eric was saying about, unique identifiers, right? Your system identifying which system is going to be used on a contract. If you've chosen the enclave approach, it's some subset. You've defined what that subset is of your IT that you're going to be compliant with, and that's where you have to do the work on your contracts, right? That's where you have to handle the data. You can't go putting it other places that weren't in that scope. And Eric pointed out that sort of bad things that can happen if you get that wrong. And I want to kind of mention there's a difference between a lie and a mistake, right? So certainly lying in intentionally misrepresenting your compliance status, very bad, and there's all kinds of bad outcomes that Eric pointed out. But we've seen also this tendency when the DIPCAC, this is the DoD's auditors, started coming out and doing assessments a couple of years ago. They observed this very wide disparity between self-reported SPURS scores and what they found when they actually got on site and started looking at it. Something like 80% perceived they were compliant, but only 20% actually were. And I'm kind of rounding those numbers. It's been a couple of years now since they released them. But it was this big, wide disparity. And I think that's an inherent challenge of self-assessment, right? If you don't know how to implement the controls properly, you probably also don't know how to assess the controls properly. And so you may be overly generous in that assessment, and that leads to a score that doesn't reflect reality. So I think the advice here is, if you're doing self-assessment, which some of us can do under CMMC, if you're doing self-assessment, make sure that the people doing it have an accurate perception of what it is they're assessing, right? Don't have the same people that implemented it, maybe wrong, assess it, maybe wrong, and then you've sort of compounded that error. Make sure you're getting good, strong advice that you trust.
And I just want to add really quick, because I think Ed made some really terrific points, is that there's a difference between an honest mistake when you're trying and a mistake because you're not trying, right? I'm oversimplifying kind of the False Claims Act there, but I think the level of effort is important, and if you could tell a good story, you can help yourself quite a bit as well.
No, that's great. Great context. Thank you. The bottom line being, yes, your SPRS is being looked at, your SSPs are being compared, and misalignment doesn't stay invisible for long. And if you can't point to it, don't report it. But that brings us to our next question. Contractors are asking more often than ever, what are primes actually allowed and expected to ask? So, Eric, we hear a lot from subcontractors fearing that, of being audited by their primes. Legally speaking, what does a subcontractor audit actually look like? What are primes not only allowed, but expected to ask with your
Yeah.
knowledge?
Well, I could go on for the rest of the session. I won't do that though, for everyone's
Feel
benefit.
free.
So we'll do a quick rundown. But the prime sub relationship, it's really important to remember, is governed by the subcontract agreement. Now, for new entrants, new relationships that are being memorialized now, they should have the foresight to be able to write into their subcontract agreements what the prime can and can't do. It's interesting for those existing relationships that are subject to a prime sub relationship, and maybe CMMC comes through a contract modification from the government, what happens? Hopefully, the prime contract has been written in a way that allows flexibility on both sides. But let's take the more usual situation we'll probably see, and that's for kind of new relationships between primes and subs. And like I said, it is controlled by contract. Now, there may be some prime contractors, and it depends on leverage between the parties, that desire the ability to do some kind of audit of their subs for compliance. There's nothing in the law that prevents that from happening if the prime and sub are agreement. But I would probably, from a general sense, there are specific exceptions to this, of course, always. But from a general sense, as a prime, I'm not necessarily itching to do a CMMC audit of my subs. First of all, I'm not set up to do that unless you hire a third party to go in and do it themselves, to do it instead. So I don't want to have audit rights as a prime contractor. Maybe I make nuts or bolts. Maybe I provide IT services. But if I'm not providing audit services for CMMC applicants, then I don't want to be doing that on my subcontractors probably. Because if I do it and I get it wrong, where I say, hey, this contractor is wonderful, they're perfect, they're all great, and then the government finds something else 6 months later, they'll think the prime is trying to cover something up, right? Or at the very least, being kind of reckless in their assessment. So I think that is something that primes should probably shy away from, in a general sense. Again, there are going to be exceptions to that.
Sure.
An exception could be that they hire a C3PO to come in and do it, right, where they're equipped to do it. Now, as a subcontractor, I think the most I would probably be willing to give up would be, here's a screenshot that shows our SPUR score or our assessment results. And by the way, there's an NDA, so you can't share that with anybody else, but I'm giving it to you for purposes of this contract performance. So you can represent to the government that the information is being protected. Otherwise, I wouldn't want to do more. And that's going to, again, be subject to negotiation between the prime and sub. There's plenty of eloquent solutions out there, but the screenshot is probably the one that's most common right now. And primes are at least seeking a copy of that, essentially under oath, or affirmed by the subcontractor that it's accurate. So I think that's where we're kind of seeing it in the supply chain right now.
Yeah, and it's important too. You did a great job of describing this, but when we're talking about primes auditing their subs, I'm not necessarily saying assessment, from a third party assessment organization.
Right.
Yeah, we're talking about like what are they asking for? I know that we know they're asking for some of them have questionnaires and so on and so forth, but
Yep.
but what you provided is really enlightening and helpful.
Yeah, and if I
Megan,
could chime in,
sure.
I think the questionnaire thing has been around forever. The problem with all questionnaires is the questions are all structured different from the last one. They're often from some internal resource, or maybe you purchased one from the internet. But the language in these questions varies, and the interpretation of that language, as we're all seeing as CMMC continues to release these updates for how to interpret a control set that was published now 8 years ago. It takes a long time for everybody to agree on what exactly the question means and what kind of evidence should be attached. So the entire premise of CMMC, FedRAMP, these central control sets, is to get us all down to a single set of language. And there's a lot of risk involved when one company sends its plans or its vulnerability information or its strategies for security and compliance over to another company. This data is really important. So the idea that when you're done your C3PAO audit, you keep the hashed data, not the assessor, not the government, is to keep the amount of sensitive information, risk related information from just going everywhere. So if everybody audits everybody, and we all have to send our scan data and our pen test results and all these kinds of pathways on how to hack us to each other, that's not good for the state of security across the entire defense industrial base. So it's not a good practice for people who don't understand the controls to be assessing the controls, but it's also really not a good practice for us all to be sharing this information more broadly than it needs to be shared. So the concept of picking a C3PAO who can interpret the data and limiting down the interactions of who gets to see this data is good for everybody involved and keeps us away from a position where we're all sending each other sensitive data and we're not necessarily interpreting it towards some ground truth of security compliance.
I think this is the kind of the one of the wonderful outcomes of CMMC, right? So Megan, you kind of introduced this as the enforcement era, but this is also the era in which we can readily demonstrate our goodness to our customers, right? So in the past, if I wanted to show my customer that I was taking security seriously, I had to answer a questionnaire that was complicated and took a lot of time, as David mentioned. In some cases, we've had to allow auditors to come in, right? Allow our customers to send in auditors to poke around. It's highly intrusive just to prove we're doing a good job. Now, even though CMMC getting a C3PAO certification is still voluntary for many of us, there's a lot of good reasons to get one, because with that certificate, you can prove your worthiness. You can prove that you've taken it seriously and passed an independent test. There just wasn't really a good framework that was universally accepted to do that. I mean, CMMC is not universally accepted, but it is in the DIV. It is within the Department of War confines. So I think this is a big advantage that is going to smooth those prime and sub transactions going forward.
Great point. Thank you for chiming in, Ed. All right. All right. So moving forward, let's talk about the lowdown on the flowdown. So as of November 10th, DFARS in 7021, 7025 are officially in effect, which means CMMC is no longer theoretical, it's enforceable. For the last few years, most of the conversation has been focused on what these clauses require of contractors, but the real shift is really happening behind the scenes. DFARS subpart 204.75 gives contracting officers very clear instructions on when they must include the clause, when they cannot make an award, and what they have to verify before extending performance. So this is where flowdown stops being paperwork. Once 7021 and 7025 are in the contract, compliance isn't just a prime issue anymore. It extends across the supply chain based on who touches the data and when. So let's talk about what that actually looks like in practice. And back over to you, Ed, on the topic of flowdown being treated as a paperwork exercise. What happens when you get the clause flowed down, but the subcontract doesn't actually receive or handle or touch CUI?
Yeah, great question, Megan. This is not necessarily new with CMMC, right? We saw this before with the 7012 clause, where the government was putting it in a lot of contracts, and people are like, hey, I don't even have any CUI, but I have this in my contract. What do I do with this? And now, with CMMC being layered on, maybe what they did before was they just say, well, we're good, right? We don't have any compliance issues because we don't have any data to protect. So when you see these flow downs as a subcontractor, the prime, government or the prime, whoever's flowing it down to you, is asking for a CUI handling capability, right? They're saying, hey, we think you're going to have CUI. There may be some rare cases where it makes sense to push back on this, right? If you're very confident that in your business model with this kind of services that you're going to do under these contracts, you're never going to handle CUI. It may make sense to push back to the prime and say, hey, I don't think I'm going to ever put CUI on my information systems based on what it is I do, and push back. But I think in most cases, That's not true. So even if you don't have CUI today, it makes more sense to have the capability that the prime is asking you for, right? So there's, instead of fighting that clause, have, if they're saying, hey, we think we might want to give you CUI and we need to know that you're capable of protecting it, be in a position to say yes. And we're very fortunate because cloud computing has enabled a very low cost entry point for these sort of small cloud only enclaves that can safely and compliantly handle CUI. So you can go buy these. The CMMC rule allows for devices that are accessing a virtual desktop infrastructure, VDI, to be out of scope. So it's possible today to build a cloud-only CUI enclave without bringing any of your current IT in scope, not even your workstations or any of that sort of thing, right? So you can leave your corporate IT footprint the way it is, have this enclave that starts small and grows as you gain contracts in CUI. So I think, like I say, unless you're very, very confident that you're never going to need CUI and it's worth pushing to get that flow down removed, the path of least resistance often is build the capability, use the advantages of the cloud to grow that as you need to grow it.
Excellent. Thank you, Ed. And Eric, I'd love for you to chime in on some of the other implications with regards to, liability implications.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the government has long said, the department has long said this for many years. They view the prime contractor as being ultimately responsible for that information that they're handling and that their subs are handling. So the government is entrusting the prime contractor, who's the one who has a contractual relationship with the government, with that information, and it's really up to the prime contractor to make sure that their subcontractors are complying. So step one of that whole process, the very basic thing a prime contractor needs to do is kind of getting the right flow downs in place and flowing them down, flowing these clauses down to the subcontractors to, at the very least, put them on notice. So those subcontract agreements should have, the 7021 and 7025 clauses in that you mentioned before, Megan, as well as kind of any other requirements such as the screenshots I mentioned earlier, whatever it may be. Perhaps there's a requirement to get assessed prior to, the signature of on a subcontract agreement or before award or something like that. Each prime contractor is handling it a little bit differently. I know you and David talked a little bit about kind of the surveys that have been sent out, dime a dozen. I've seen a lot of those as well. But that's obviously a good basic first step too. But as time goes on, if a subcontractor is not compliant and has an incident and loses information, because let's be real, most cybersecurity incidents involve subcontractors, not primes that have robust cybersecurity systems. A lot of them are the subcontractors. Then the prime contractor is going to be held responsible for that. So, flowing down properly and just ensuring compliance is the best way a prime contractor can help insulate itself. And a lot of it's going to come back to, all right, these subcontractors, it's easy for me to sit here in my office with the sun shining on my face. I'm trying to work around and say, all right, all your subcontractors have to be compliant with NIST 800-171 and they need to get a CMMC assessment as soon as possible. But from a feasibility standpoint, that's not always reasonable. A lot of subcontractors out there are really small. A lot of them don't concentrate on government business. And that's why having eloquent solutions, and I'm not just saying that because I'm on this call, but something like a Neo Systems where they're not seeking a bespoke setup, although they can have one through the solution, or just using a virtual desktop or something like that. It doesn't matter how it's accomplished, it just has to be accomplished. So those flow downs are, from the very base level, the first thing that has to get done. Megan, back to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Eric. All right. Let's move forward. So up to this point, we've talked a lot about your scope, controls, and your score. But again, you're not the only boat in the water, and it's no longer just about you and your organization or even your score, but managing your supply chain and the risk it introduces, whether you see it, or not. Data doesn't respect org charts, right? And risk doesn't stop at your boundary. So, David, why is it that tier 2 and 3 subcontractor risk gets missed so often and sometimes is the easiest to rationalize away?
Yeah, it's common because the data set that we're working with here is being abstracted layer by layer as you get farther from the final product. So the government knows that Defense Department knows it wants to build a fighter jet, and they know that they want the parts and pieces of that jet to be controlled. They know they want to outsource to primes, eventually to subprimes or tier three subcontractors that were looking at these, you know, set of companies that are all going to help to build this fighter jet. If you look at a bolt or a particular type of mixture that's going to go into a particular type of piece of equipment, when you're looking at it at the big equipment level, it's obvious that this is sensitive stuff. We're going to resource it from one of just a couple companies that make this stuff for us. Um, the government's not going to typically go out and find 5,000 different suppliers. They're going to work with the prime who's going to break this information out into various sets of companies. So as that data set gets abstracted further and further from the purpose, it's less and less clear per layer how your information or what about your information is important for the government in terms of confidentiality. So you kind of lose the context. You keep getting to derivative data, and it's harder and harder to understand if each, derived data set continues to be controlled or not. So I think a lot of it has to do with just sort of the making these small containers of data where the bigger picture is lost. I also think throughout today's discussion, we've talked a lot about tier one, tier two, tier three. It's also, I think, it's hard for the government when they're writing the flow down to a prime. It's hard for the prime. It gets harder and harder for each of the contracting officers to put the right information in. So there's this repeated sort of whisper down the lane problem that's happening again because the context is lost, the data set's less clear, and the level of education for each group. I mean, if it's your full business model, you have 5 people that do this. If you only do this occasionally, every once in a while, it's somebody's side job, and they're not as good at it as perhaps a full-time professional. So this sort of continued watering down of the skill set, the attention to detail, and the context, I think really make it so that you can't tell if you're a tier two or tier three, and it's hard to tell what about what you're doing in this contract is in fact the sensitive data.
Thank you. No, that's perfect. If we can agree that, you're not the only boat in the water, there's this chain, then the next question, the next question becomes what do strong organizations actually do about it? So,
Yeah, and I think if we want to go to the next slide here, I think that strong organization and applying tiered risk management, there's many systems for this. The new revision of 800-171 talks to supply chain risk management. The government has long talked about, system development life cycles that start with identification and then protection. So inventory management, list management. So strong organizations are aware that any point in time list they make of their contractors is about to age out the day they make it. So they're using lifecycle approaches to data management. A list once made is maintained under change control with continuous monitoring to make sure the list doesn't drift away. So applying that to your subcontractor and supply chain is the start of that answer. There's definitely a lot of approaches to it, tools that can help, but fundamentally understanding that your subcontractor risk, both directions from your vendors and flowing down, this is going to be a moving target, and you need to have some kind of life cycle approach to manage it.
perfect.
There's an audience question that I think is going to illustrate this pretty well. So I'm going to use that and maybe go off script a little bit here.
Excellent.
But the question, I'll read the question out. It says, how do you bring CUI from the enclave into a non-compliant work environment? The prime sends part models. We need to bring them into our CAD system in order to select or design our product, which is COTS. So here's a subcontractor that's thinking, hey, I'm a COTS provider. CMMC probably doesn't apply to me. I don't need this. But they're saying, I need to look at the CUI documents in my CAD system in order to select or design. Now, I would say if you're designing a product based on customer delivered specifications, you might not qualify for the COTS, but let's say you're just looking at those drawings to be able to select the product. So the short answer to the question is you can't, right? You can't bring CUI from an enclave that your prime holds into a non-compliant work environment. You just can't do it. So you're either going to need to do one of two things there. You're either going to need to get your CAD system compliant, meaning put it into its own little enclave or have a version of it that is compliant, or you're going to have to go look at those drawings on the prime's system, right? Go view them on their CAD system. Don't use yours, and maybe that's not feasible, but if it is, you could look at it on theirs, right? So that's a good example in teasing this apart, this subcontractor talking to their prime and saying, what is the actual data flow here, right? So the thing that needs to happen is I need to pick a COTS product and deliver it to you. But in order to pick it, I need to do some stuff. I need to do some stuff with the CUI. Does that mean I need to put it on the subcontractor systems? In which case the flow down is going to happen, right? And that subcontractor is going to have to build a system that is capable of storing that CUI. So they have to build a compliant system and get it certified. Or can they not flow the data down? The data remains with the prime and the subcontractor simply goes and looks at it on their enclave and their system using some viewing tools or some other controlled way so that it does not flow. So this, I think, is a really good illustration. Like, this is a complicated conversation. There's not a quick and easy answer here. And this is a conversation you probably, if you're putting together, if you're a system integrator, you're putting together things from a lot of suppliers. You have a big, complicated supply chain. There's a lot of conversations about a lot of different specific use cases going on. Sometimes the data flows, sometimes it doesn't. So understanding those data flows, difficult, but that's what you got to do, right? That's how this compliance regime works. You have to follow the data and follow it down. So again, short answer to the audience members' question, how do you do it? How do you move the data, the CUI data, onto a non-compliant system? You don't, you can't. So you need to find some other way to get this to work.
All right. Thank you. That was a great question. Thank you, Ed, for the color. All right, so we've talked about anticipating changes and defining your scope, and now we're going to talk about managing those changes. So turning this back over to you, David, as CMMC enforcement ramps up, what are your top three recommendations to the subs listening here today that are looking to manage compliance drifts? And what does that look like for organizations that need to scale securely?
Yeah, I think Ed just did a great job of explaining why for most organizations, this is not a do-it-yourself activity. There
Right.
are many ins and outs. There's a lot of skill sets that need to come together for you to have a clear, own your scope, understand your boundary kind of answer. Neo Systems ourselves, we work with tons of suppliers who know this better than we do in its various expertises. We work with Eric on these kinds of things. We work with a lot of people who have a different lens to the very complex answer to which part of it is CUI, what kind of technology might work to handle it, and then that changes. The landscape changes, the technology changes, Microsoft changes, the rule set changes. So you achieve this goal, you pass your point in time assessment, you're required to have a configuration management plan. You'll soon need to have a supply chain risk management plan. But
Yep.
with all of these plans, what you're effectively trying to do is what did I build the first time? Has it changed? Did I control the change so that when I'm done making this necessary change, I'm still compliant? And that life cycle approach, that whole flow of I did it once, I need to keep doing it forever. There's a combination of change control, there's a combination of continuous monitoring, alerting that something has now drifted. Those systems aren't, they don't come from nowhere. They're not that common. You have to know what you intended to do before you can measure and monitor for change. So you start out by making a list of all the things that you want to look the way you want them to look with intention. So how many assets should I have in my enclave or in my enterprise system? And do I in fact have that many? The same question for your suppliers, for your vendors. I intend to work with the following service providers to accomplish the following goals. When that list changes over time, you can't remember sort of to go update your list. The question for the DIB is at this point, don't implement a new supplier until you add them to the list and you go through the impact analysis and talk about, are they CMMC compliant or FedRAMP compliant? Do they not need compliance? If not, why? And it's the writing down of this list of suppliers or list of assets, your intentions, that get you into a position where you're not, as Eric put it earlier, making mistakes through ignorance. Ignorance isn't a defense. You can't just say, well, I didn't know I wasn't supposed to. It was an oversight because I wasn't even trying to look. So by documenting your compliance, monitoring against your documentation, you've created the kind of defensibility that you want to prove that you're not just, we all make mistakes. We all assess controls differently than DIBCAC might do it today or yesterday. It's your intention, it's your documentation, your defensibility that turns that from, willful neglect to the common kind of mistake that happens when you're trying to make a complicated control implementation judgment. So kind of, one, understand you probably need help. We all do. Two, make a list and be checking it twice. Three, work on observability for yourself from a security perspective for, zero trust maturity model or observability for security. That same observability is what helps you pass your compliance. Compliance comes easily to secure environments because secure environments have observability, change control, and continuous monitoring built into them.
And I'll just add really quick, because David brought up some really terrific points, is that, it's really best practice to kind of vet suppliers anyway. So this is like another kind of tick on the list of things to look at when you're vetting suppliers. So it should be something for best practice that should already be being done. And this is just a little bit of an expansion of that scope of the vet that you're going to do. Thanks.
Yeah, no, that's excellent point. Thank you. All right, real quick, we're running out of time and we want to get around to some questions. So I'm going to speed through this last one. From looking across, taking a step, zooming out across the full CMMC lifecycle, from contract award, onboarding, scoping, assessment, this is where MSPs actually help reduce risk. And yes, I say that fully aware that I'm representing one, but this only works as a partnership. When it works, it doesn't feel like outsourcing. It feels like another set of hands on the rope, helping prevent surprises, manage change, stop compliance drift before it becomes an issue. So putting this back out to David first, but I want everybody in 60 seconds or less. What do you actually need from contractors, subs to help you manage risk effectively? As an MSP, how can subs help their MSPs reduce risk across the CMMC project life cycle?
Yeah, and this is going to cover external providers of all sorts. You need to make sure you're communicating effectively. All big projects, all big efforts where more than one person's involved. Communication, the structure for communication, how you put in tickets, how you put in requests, how they get serviced, who's accountable for what in your shared responsibility matrix for your number two, well-defined boundary. This communicating on your shared responsibilities for your well-defined boundary. These are really critical for any external service provider that you're going to interact with. If they don't know your boundary and you guys aren't communicating, the chance that your risk is being reduced plummets. So I think the last bit of that is understand no external service provider or managed service provider is going to do it all. You will have some administrative boundary or responsibilities. You will have to own your scope, help them understand your boundaries. So while MSPs can help and do help, communications required, clear boundaries and shared responsibilities are required, and there'll always be some administrative burden that your company needs to go through.
Thank you, David. And I want to thank everybody for joining us today. Really, really are grateful for every one of you, and we're happy to be here to help in any way that we can. When it comes to CMMC, our focus at Neosystems is pretty simple. We want to give contractors an accelerated, affordable, low-risk path to compliance without forcing them to become IT or compliance experts in the process. So this is where our solutions come in. We've got our base, which is a fully managed CY-ready Microsoft 365 environment designed to help contractors securely handle sensitive data, CY, while accelerating CMMC Level 2 readiness. And then we have our frame, which is a secure Azure-based hosting environment configured by us to support DFARS and FedRAMP aligned workloads. It's purpose-built for government contractors running business-critical applications like ERP, financial systems that interact with CUI. It provides that compliant foundation without the overhead of on-prem infrastructure. And I'll add this, we are CMMC Level 2 certified ourselves. So again, we're not asking or expecting our clients to do anything we haven't already done. All right, with that out of the way, let's get to the questions. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Megan. So we've had quite a few questions come in, so we're going to try to get through these as quickly as we can. The first question is regarding risk associated with scoring. How much accountability is shared by the service provider when the CMMC policy development and maintenance and technology implementation are outsourced to the service provider?
I'll chime in. I think well, how much accountability is shared depends on the contract you have with that service provider, right? So you have, as the contractor, obviously full accountability for compliance. If you choose to outsource that, it's about what did that person agree, what did that company agree to in that agreement? Did they agree to provide these documents? Did they agree to stand behind them if they're found to be non-compliant? So for example, in Neo Systems, we guarantee that the services we provide are CMMC compliant, meaning if we give you a document and we present that document as compliant and it turns out that it's not because we got it wrong somehow, then that's on us. We own the accountability for that. So it comes down to what is that relationship like, and what you can't do is sort of outsource the responsibility for compliance, but you can certainly hire experts that are going to do it for you, and you want to make sure you have both trust in them, that they have the right credentials, and you want to make sure you have some contract in place where they're going to stand behind that. And I think the big thing when you're thinking about an ESP is, are they saying in contract that those services are going to be compliant with the applicable regulations that you need to meet? That's number one. And I mean, Megan mentioned, like, we've gotten CMMC certified. There's a couple dozen only, right, MSPs in the world that are CMMC certified today. Now it's just getting started. The number's going to grow, but out of 100,000 plus MSPs in the world, only a couple dozen of them are certified today, and that means those are the only ones that have really been through the process. It's not mandatory; it's voluntary. But if you're choosing who to work with, choose one that's done it and knows how to succeed through that process.
And I'll just add to Ed's excellent point that a lot of the work that MSPs do could be in scope. And you want to find out for the first time that your MSP is not compliant when you're going through an assessment and they're part of your scope. So choosing one that's already compliant with NIST 800-171 that has gotten certified is obviously an advantage that could be really helpful in lowering that risk of an assessment going sideways.
Yeah, and in a practical sense, when you work through an assessment, the assessor shows up, they're going to look at every control and every assessment objective. If you're allowing or working with a company like Neosystems, who's going to write a lot of those answers for you for a product that we've built for you, observability is key. We should be able to make it observably true for you that your accounts are provisioned correctly in Entra ID. So you, the organization seeking compliance, whether you're working with 10 vendors or one, they should be able to make it observably true for you per assessment objective before you're ready for audit, or at least at the time of audit, that all these systems are configured to what is written in the system security plan and as documented in your shared responsibility matrix with that provider. So, there's a lot of complexity to getting that right. There's a trust factor. There is also an ongoing observable evidence factor there. So how much risk are you taking on? If you've never even tried to look at any observable evidence that your provider is doing what they say, probably a lot of risk. Working through a mock assessment, working through, having them produce observable evidence for an internal assessment, both can help you to establish that kind of trust. But, again, MSPs are not a full answer. They are to support you in your well-defined boundary with good communication to get through this. So you can't really just write it off and say it's done. You do have some responsibility there for trust but verify.
All right, we still got a few questions here. We're pushing up against the top of the hour, so we'll see if we can get through these quickly. The next question is, if there is no clause, regulation, or DoD instruction that supports treating unmarked data as CUI, on what authority should a prime do so?
I could jump in here and talk to that a little bit. So this is an area of a lot of controversy, I would say. But there inevitably is going to be some data that's not marked as CUI that may be CUI. For instance, data that the government mistakenly does not mark, or data that the contractor creates, right? There is CUI sometimes created in the context of contract performance. Obviously, the government can't mark that as soon as it's created. That doesn't mean it's not CUI. And if you look at the 7012 clause and you look at what is defined as CUI, the inescapable conclusion to me is that sometimes there's some data that contractors should treat it as CUI, even if it's not CUI. If nothing else, even if the regulations don't require it, it's a best practice. If nothing else, it will prevent inquiries from the government down the road. So I think it's still important to treat non-CUI or things that are not necessarily labeled as CUI because there are circumstances where it's possible it could be CUI and unmarked. But if you look for the specific regulation, if you look at the 7012 clause too, and how they define CUI, they say it's things that are marked as CUI or things that are in the registry that are transmitted, stored, et cetera, by the contractor during the course of performance of the contract. So there is regulatory authority for that position as well.
Yeah, and document why you think it is, why you think it isn't. Write it all down. Make sure you work with people like Eric or others who can help you to make a defensible argument so that this gray area stuff, you've not been ignorant to it. You're acknowledging that it's a difficult choice and you're writing down why you made the choices you made with educated, maybe third-party people who can really help you validate that.
I think
That's the defensibility part.
absolutely. I think that's a terrific point. Kind of documenting the reasoning, working with outside experts to help you through the process. If your ultimate goal is to at least avoid a False Claims Act case, you're kind of getting yourself out of the False Claims Act realm by taking it seriously, doing what you can do, not being reckless or purposefully ignoring the CUI. So I think that's a great point.
All right, next question. How would you recommend handling an in-scope vendor's pushback on providing their shared responsibility matrix on grounds of confidentiality? Assume the confidentiality agreements are in place and it's a long-term mutual relationship.
I'll take this one. They're being silly. Don't do business with them.
It's a
Quick answer. The CMMC law, the CMMC regulation requires that an ESP provide a service description and a customer responsibility matrix. So technically, it's not called a shared responsibility matrix. In the law, it's called a customer responsibility matrix. That's a required element under the regulation. So if they're saying I can't give you that required element because of it's too secret, then they're not interpreting the regulation properly. They're not doing what they're supposed to do as an ESP. So it's again, it's a mandatory thing that the service provider, the external service provider, tell their customer, here's what I'm doing, service description, or here's what I'm doing, and here's what you must do, customer responsibility matrix. That's a required element. They have to share it with you under the regulation. If they won't, they don't understand the regulation properly.
And I will say, shared responsibility or customer responsibility matrix has been a gray area for a long, long time. There are still companies, Neo Systems, that are refining our approach to this so we can be as communicative as possible. So if they're outright saying, no, you can't have one, I agree with Ed. If you guys need to work together to get to the right amount of detail in the CRM, SRM to be effective for both companies, that's probably the right answer. They're not all, this is not a perfect science just yet. So I would say give some grace, but also if the answer is no, you'll never get one, that's not the right answer.
No, and I can see where they might want to put it under NDA, but the question was, assume the NDA is in place. So it is something that some people might consider proprietary and not want to share publicly, but they definitely should share it under NDA.
All right, we are at the top of the hour and gotten through as many questions as we can. So I want to thank everyone for attending today. We appreciate your time. Certainly want to thank all of our speakers for great presentation, great information and content. Also want to remind everyone that This is the first episode in our 5-part webinar series on surviving to thriving. So please keep an eye out for an invitation to the next episode, which will likely be coming up in a few weeks. So please keep an eye out, and we look forward to seeing you then. Have a great day.
Thanks,
Thank you,
everybody.
everybody.